The moment my father-in-law climbed into my truck after leaving the hospital, he gripped my forearm harder than I'd ever felt a 79-year-old man could. His voice was barely louder than a breath. "Don't take me home." He glanced over his shoulder toward the hospital entrance before looking back at me. "Drive to my lawyer's office before my family realizes I'm gone." For a second, I honestly thought the stroke had confused him. Then I looked into his eyes. They were clear, steady, scared. I shifted my old 2020 Ford F-250 into drive and pulled away from St. Vincent Medical Center in Indianapolis without another word. I had no idea that simple drive would cost me my marriage, my reputation, and nearly everything I'd spent 30 years building. But it would also uncover the truth about the family I'd married into, and the only man in that family who had ever truly treated me like a son. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 58 years old. I spent most of my life fixing heating and air conditioning systems around Central Ohio. Nothing glamorous, just honest work that kept people warm through freezing winters and cool during those sticky July afternoons when the humidity made you sweat before you even stepped outside. My hands still carried tiny scars from sheet metal and old generator cabinets. I never minded. A day's work always helped me sleep. I'd been married to Rachel for 30 years. We had a comfortable little ranch house outside Indianapolis. No mansion, no vacation home in Florida, no luxury cars, just a paid-off mortgage, 2 aging pickup trucks, and enough saved for retirement if we stayed careful. That had always been enough for me. Apparently, it was never enough for Rachel's brothers. Kevin Hayes was the oldest. He owned a commercial landscaping company and loved reminding people how successful he was. Martin, the younger brother, sold commercial real estate and somehow managed to turn every family dinner into a speech about investment opportunities. Whenever they talked to me, it was with the same polite smile people use when speaking to someone they don't expect much from. "The electrical business still keeping you busy, Dan? You ever think about getting into something bigger?" After 30 years, I could practically finish their sentences. Rachel rarely defended me. She usually changed the subject. I convinced myself that was enough. The only person who never made me feel small was their father, Walter Hayes. He never cared what kind of truck I drove or how expensive my watch wasn't. Whenever I visited the ranch near Greensburg, he'd wave me toward the porch. "Coffee's fresh." That was usually his entire greeting. Some people talk because they like hearing themselves. Walter talked only when he had something worth saying. Those quiet mornings on his porch became some of my favorite memories. 10 days earlier, Walter had suffered a mild stroke while feeding cattle. Thankfully, one of the neighbors found him quickly. The doctors expected a good recovery. Every day, I asked Rachel if she wanted to visit. Sometimes we did. Sometimes she said her brothers were already there. I never questioned it. The morning Walter was discharged, our family group text came alive before sunrise. Kevin couldn't leave because of an emergency shareholders meeting. Martin had a golf tournament with potential clients. Rachel said she'd promised months ago to lead the women's ministry meeting at church. Then came the final message. "Dan's retired enough. He can make the drive." Nobody asked. They simply decided. I looked at Rachel. She was pouring coffee like the conversation was over. "I'll go," I said. She nodded without looking up. "Thanks." That was it. No apology, no offer to come along. Just thanks. So, I left before daylight and drove the 100-plus miles east toward Indianapolis. The radio stayed off most of the trip. I like driving in silence anyway. It gave me room to think, or maybe to avoid thinking. Now, Walter sat quietly beside me. The truck hummed down Interstate 74. 5 minutes passed. 10, neither of us spoke. Finally, he reached over and pressed the button that locked all 4 doors. Click. The sound seemed unusually loud inside the cab. He slipped a small digital recorder from the pocket of his flannel shirt. It looked old. The kind reporters carried 10 years ago. "I need you to hear something." He pressed play. Static filled the truck, then voices. Kevin's voice came first. "If we split the Maple Ridge into residential lots, we'll make twice as much." Martin laughed. "No point waiting forever. Dad probably won't make another New Year's anyway." Another laugh. Then Kevin again. "We should start talking to developers now." Someone coughed. A hospital monitor beeped softly in the background. Then silence. Walter clicked the recorder off. I was awake. I couldn't find words. The highway stretched ahead, while my mind stayed inside that hospital room. I pretended to be asleep, Walter said quietly. They never noticed. His weathered hands rested on the recorder. I've listened to that conversation every day since. I swallowed. I'm sorry. He looked out the passenger window. So am I. Another mile passed before he spoke again. I've waited 10 years for today. That sentence hit me almost harder than the recording. 10 years. He nodded. I'll explain. Attorney Laura Miller's office occupied the second floor of a brick building just a few blocks from the courthouse downtown. She greeted Walter by name. No surprise, no confusion. She'd been expecting us. That was my first clue this hadn't been arranged overnight. Her conference room overlooked Market Street. She offered coffee. Neither of us touched it. Instead of discussing a will immediately, Walter reached into his jacket and laid a small brass key on the table. Laura unlocked a fireproof cabinet behind her desk. She removed a thick sealed envelope, dust-coated the top. This has been here 7 years, she said. 7 years. I stared at Walter. You planned this 7 years ago? He smiled sadly. I hoped I'd never need it. Laura slid the envelope toward him. Inside were handwritten notes, property records, letters, dates, carefully organized. Not panic. Preparation. Years of it. I started writing after my wife died, Walter said softly. I noticed things changing. He glanced at me. Not all at once. A little at a time. He paused. People don't usually become greedy overnight. Laura quietly excused herself, leaving us alone. Walter folded his hands. Daniel, do you remember all those fishing trips we kept postponing? I laughed once. Sure, you were always busy. He shook his head. No, I wasn't. I frowned. What do you mean? I invited you. More than once. I never got your answer. My stomach tightened. I never got the invitations. I know. The room suddenly felt smaller. Walter let out a slow breath. There are things Rachel doesn't know. He stopped, then corrected himself, and there are things she chose not to know. I stared at him. He wasn't angry. He sounded tired, very tired. Then he said the sentence that stayed with me long after that day ended. By tonight, he whispered, everyone in my family is going to hate you. Outside, my phone vibrated again. Rachel, then Kevin, then Martin. I turned the phone face down on the table. For the first time in 30 years, I realized I might not know my own family nearly as well as I thought I did. By the time we left Laura Miller's office, it was almost 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The drive back to Greensburg felt much longer than it had that morning. Walter didn't ask me what I was thinking. He probably already knew. I kept replaying two things in my head. Kevin laughing about selling the ranch and Walter's quiet words. There are things Rachel doesn't know and things she chose not to know. Those two sentences refused to leave me alone. About 20 m outside Indianapolis, I finally broke the silence. Walter. He looked over. Did Rachel know about that recording? He shook his head. No. Did she know her brothers were talking to developers? I don't believe so. I waited, but he rested one hand on the dashboard. She stopped asking questions years ago. The answer hurt more than I expected. Not because it accused Rachel of anything. Because I knew it was true. Some people lie. Others simply stopped wanting to know the truth. We pulled into the gravel driveway just after 3:30. 3 vehicles were already parked outside the ranch house. Kevin's black GMC Yukon, Martin's silver Acura, Rachel's Subaru Outback. The moment my truck rolled to a stop, Kevin stormed out of the house. I heard his boots crunching across the gravel before I opened my door. Where the hell have you been? His voice echoed across the yard. You've been gone 6 hours. Martin wasn't far behind. We've been calling all day. Neither one of them walked over to Walter. Neither one asked how he was feeling. Their eyes stayed on me. Walter slowly opened the passenger door. The brothers immediately softened their expressions. Dad, Kevin forced a smile. We were worried sick. Walter leaned heavily on his cane. No, he said calmly. You were curious. Kevin blinked. What? I went exactly where I needed to go. Nothing more. No explanation. He simply walked toward the porch. I grabbed his overnight bag and followed him. Behind me, Kevin muttered something under his breath. Martin folded his arms. Neither of them looked happy. Inside the house, Rachel met us near the kitchen. She hugged her father carefully. I'm glad you're home. Walter smiled. So am I. She turned toward me. Can we talk later? Her voice was polite. Too polite. I nodded. Sure. Dinner felt like sitting inside a room full of strangers. Forks scraped against plates. Someone poured iced tea. Nobody spoke for nearly 5 minutes. Finally, Kevin cleared his throat. So, he looked directly at me. Where exactly did you two go? I took a bite of mashed potatoes before answering. Out. Martin laughed. Out where? Walter answered before I could. I asked Daniel to drive. He drove. That's all anybody needs to know. Kevin forced another smile. Dad, if something important happened, were your children? Walter looked him straight in the eye. Then perhaps you should have come to the hospital. The room went silent. Martin suddenly became very interested in his green beans. Rachel stared at her plate. No one spoke again until dinner ended. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 10:45, I walked downstairs for a glass of water. As I stepped into the garage, I froze. The light inside my truck was on. Rachel stood beside the driver's seat. She didn't hear me. She was searching through the center console methodically. Glove compartment, registration folder, receipts, even the small compartment where I kept spare reading glasses. What are you doing? She jumped. The flashlight in her hand slipped onto the seat. She hesitated. I was looking for something. What? She looked away. The receipt. What receipt? The lawyer. For several seconds, neither of us moved. You followed me. No. She folded her arms. Kevin said, Dad probably changed something. So you searched my truck? I needed to know. I took a slow breath. You could have asked. I am asking. Her voice cracked. What did Dad sign? Walter had made me promise. No matter what happened, no matter who asked, I couldn't tell anyone. I can't answer that. Rachel stared at me. You can't. No. Or you won't. They're the same thing. She shook her head slowly. I've never kept secrets from you. I almost reminded her about the fishing trips, about the invitations I'd apparently never received. Instead, I simply said, I gave Walter my word. She walked past me without another sentence. A bedroom door closed upstairs. It sounded louder than it should have. At that moment, I still didn't understand why Walter trusted me more than his own sons. But if you were in my position, would you have believed him? The next morning, my phone rang before 8. Laura Miller. Good morning, Daniel. Morning. I wanted you to know your father-in-law completed everything. Everything. Such a small word. Such clears throat. Enormous consequences. The trust is now effective. She paused. I also wanted to thank you. For what? For showing up. I frowned. I only drove him. No, you did something much harder than that. Before hanging up, she added, things may become uncomfortable for a while. That turned out to be the understatement of the year. By Wednesday, the rumors had already begun. Greensburg, clears throat, isn't a large town. News doesn't travel. It explodes. At Greensburg Supply, where I'd been buying generator parts for 20 years, conversation stopped when I walked in. At the diner on Main Street, 2 men lowered their voices as I passed. Sunday morning at church felt even worse. The Hayes family had attended the same church for generations. People smiled politely, but something had changed. After the service, an older gentleman I'd known for years stopped beside me. Dan. He hesitated. I hope none of what folks are saying is true. What are they saying? He looked uncomfortable. That you convinced Walter to cut his children out. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I'd never do that. I didn't think so, but people are talking. Of course they were. Rumors always traveled faster than facts. A few days later, I noticed a gray SUV parked across from our house. The same SUV appeared outside one of my service calls. Then again, near the grocery store. At first, I thought I was imagining things until I saw the driver taking pictures. He wasn't very good at hiding it. I walked across the parking lot. He started his engine immediately and drove away. That evening, I called Laura. I think someone's following me, she sighed. I was afraid of that. You knew Kevin hired a private investigator. I rubbed my forehead. Why? He believes you manipulated Walter. I fixed air conditioners for a living. I've never manipulated anybody. I know, but grief and greed often sound alike. 2 nights later, Laura asked me to stop by her office after hours. She locked the front door behind me. Without saying a word, she placed a thick folder on the conference table. I think you should see this. Inside were copies of emails, draft contracts, property valuation reports, maps of Walter's ranch land divided into housing lots. One document caught my eye. Letter of intent pending probate. The date at the top made my chest tighten. 3 months before Walter had even suffered a stroke. They were planning this before he got sick. Laura nodded. Kevin had already begun confidential discussions with a regional developer. I kept turning pages. There were emails discussing road access, utility easements, estimated profits. Someone had even written, "Once probate clears, this should move quickly." Probate. They were planning their father's funeral before he'd even become seriously ill. I leaned back in my chair. I thought Walter overhearing that conversation in the hospital was the beginning. Laura looked at me sadly. "No, Daniel." She tapped the folder. "This started years ago. I left her office carrying nothing. She wouldn't let me take copies. Too risky. But I carried something much heavier. The realization that the family I trusted for 3 decades had been living a very different story than the one I believed. And somehow I had only just stepped into the middle of it. The first person to stop trusting me wasn't Kevin. It wasn't Martin. It was my own wife. I wish I could tell you there was one huge fight that changed everything. There wasn't. It happened the way old houses fall apart. One loose board, one cracked window, one leak nobody fixes. Until one day, you realize the place you called home isn't holding together anymore. For the next 2 weeks, Rachel barely spoke to me unless she had to. She left before I woke up. She went to bed before I came upstairs. 30 years of marriage had turned into polite conversations about groceries and utility bills. "Did you pay the electric?" "Yes." "Your doctor's appointment is Wednesday." "I know." Nothing more. One evening, I found her sitting alone on the back porch. The sun was dropping behind the maple trees, painting the yard orange. She held a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. I sat beside her. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I asked quietly, "Do you really believe I'd steal from your father?" She kept staring at the backyard. "I don't know what to believe anymore." That answer hurt more than if she'd simply said yes. "You know me." I thought I did. I nodded slowly. "So did I." She finally looked at me. "Why won't you tell me what happened that day?" "Because I promised him. I'm your wife." "I know. You should trust me." "I do." "Then prove it." I looked down at my hands. Hands that had built generators, replaced control panels, carried our children when they were little. Hands that had never signed a dishonest invoice. "I can't." She stood. "So, your promise to my father matters more than your marriage." I answered before I had time to soften the truth. "No, my promise matters because your father is the only person who asked me to keep one." She stared at me, neither angry nor shocked, just wounded. She walked inside. The screen door slapped shut behind her. I stayed on the porch until it grew dark. 3 days later, the rumors became expensive. I was doing fewer repair jobs now that I'd eased into retirement, but I still handled maintenance contracts for several longtime customers. One of them called, Dan. His voice sounded embarrassed. "I'm going with another company." "No problem. I've heard some things." I figured I just don't want any trouble. After we hung up, I sat in my truck for nearly 10 minutes without starting it. The money didn't bother me. The reason did. By the end of the week, 2 more customers canceled, then another. Not because I'd done bad work. Because someone had convinced them I couldn't be trusted. Sunday was worse. Church had always been the one place where people knew me simply as Daniel. Not the electrical guy, not Walter's son-in-law, just Daniel. That morning, I walked into the fellowship hall carrying a plate of donuts like I had dozens of times before. Conversation slowed, not stopped, slowed. There's a difference. People smiled. They nodded. Then they quietly returned to conversations I wasn't part of. An old friend named Ethan finally pulled me aside. "I probably shouldn't say this then." "Don't." He smiled weakly. "I think you deserve to know." He lowered his voice. "Kevin's been telling people Walter changed everything because you isolated him." I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. I drove the man home from the hospital. "I know, but most folks don't know the whole story." "Neither do I." Ethan squeezed my shoulder. "I'm sorry. So was I?" The pastor began speaking before either of us could say anything else. 3 weeks later, Kevin filed a petition in probate court. He claimed Walter had lacked the mental capacity to create the trust and update parts of his estate plan. He also accused Laura Miller of allowing undue influence by me. That phrase became the center of everything. Undue influence. According to Kevin's attorney, I had manipulated an elderly man into changing legal documents for my own benefit. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been my life, because the truth was almost embarrassing. I hadn't asked Walter for a single thing. The hearing took place in the Decatur County Courthouse on a gray morning in February. Snow covered the sidewalks outside. Inside, people filled nearly every bench. Farmers Herald had known for decades. Church members, a few local reporters. In small towns, courtrooms become community theaters whenever families start fighting over land. Laura leaned toward me before proceedings began. Remember, I'm listening. Don't argue. I won't answer only what's asked. I nodded. I understand. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered. Everything suddenly became very quiet. Kevin's attorney spoke first. He was polished, confident, the kind of lawyer who never seemed to look at his notes. He painted a simple story. An elderly man suffered a stroke. A son-in-law isolated him. A new trust appeared. The family lost control of property that had belonged to them for generations. Then he pointed directly at me. Mr. Carter benefited enormously. That wasn't even true, but saying it confidently made it sound believable. When Laura stood, she didn't rush. She carried one thin folder to the podium. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "the evidence tells a very different story." The first witness was Walter's neurologist. The doctor explained that Walter had experienced a mild stroke affecting movement, not judgment. He reviewed the cognitive evaluations performed the day before Walter signed the trust. Mr. Hayes answered every question correctly. "Were you concerned about dementia?" "No." "Confusion?" "No." "Impaired decision-making?" "No." Kevin's attorney tried to challenge him. The doctor never wavered. For the first time that morning, I saw Kevin shift in his chair. Laura then called herself as a witness. She explained her standard procedures. She had met privately with Walter. No family members present. She had asked him the same questions twice on different days. His answers matched. She had insisted on independent witnesses. 2 legal assistants from her office had watched every signature. Not me. I simply drove Walter to the appointment. Kevin's lawyer frowned. That argument had just disappeared. I silently thanked Laura. Walter had planned even that. Then came the recording. Laura held up the small digital recorder Walter had carried in my truck. "I'd like the court to hear Exhibit 10. The room filled with static. Then Kevin's voice. "If we split the Maple Ridge." Martin laughed. "Dad probably won't make another New Year's." No one moved. Even the court reporter looked up for a second. When the recording ended, the silence felt heavier than the audio itself. Kevin's attorney stood immediately. "Private recordings can be misleading." Laura nodded. "They can, which is why this isn't our strongest evidence." She wasn't bluffing. Next came printed emails and text messages. Laura projected one onto a courtroom screen. Letter of intent subject to probate. 3 months before Walter entered the hospital. Property maps. Estimated lot prices. Discussions about utility access. One message from Kevin read, "Once Dad passes, we'll move quickly before neighbors complain." I heard someone in the gallery quietly whisper, "Oh my God." The judge removed his glasses. He spent several minutes reading every page himself. Kevin still refused to give in. He never sold anything. He only explored possibilities. Laura smiled politely. "I agree. Which is why I'd like to call Mr. Thomas Avery." An older man with silver hair walked to the witness stand. I recognized him immediately. Kevin's former accountant. He had retired the previous year. After taking the oath, he looked directly at the judge. "I've struggled with whether to come today." "What changed your mind?" Laura asked. Walter deserved better. He explained that Kevin had instructed him months earlier to prepare tax projections based on proceeds from selling the ranch. Then came the sentence that changed the room. I was also asked to review paperwork involving a refundable deposit from a development company. Kevin's attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection." The judge looked over. "On what grounds?" "Hearsay." Laura calmly handed over certified financial records. The judge reviewed them. "Overruled." Mr. Avery continued. "The money was placed in escrow pending probate." Not clears throat. An illegal sale, but proof that Kevin fully expected to sell land that wasn't yet his. By then, Kevin looked pale. Martin wouldn't even meet anyone's eyes. I thought it was over. It wasn't. Laura looked toward me. Mr. Carter. She held up a familiar envelope. I believe Mr. Hayes left this in your care. My heart started pounding. I walked slowly to the witness stand. For weeks, I'd carried that sealed envelope everywhere, never opening it, never even holding it longer than necessary. Now, I carefully broke the seal. Inside were several handwritten pages. The paper shook slightly in my hands, not because I was nervous, because I already missed the man who'd written them. I looked toward the judge. May I read this? He nodded. You may. I took a breath. My children. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear the heating system humming above us. If you're hearing these words, I'm gone. I loved each of you more than you will ever know. But love cannot survive without honesty. I turned the page. Kevin, you measured this ranch in dollars while I was still measuring my remaining days. Martin, you missed moments that can never be rescheduled. And Daniel, I had to stop for a second. My voice caught. I cleared my throat. The only man who never asked me for anything is the one person I trusted with everything that truly mattered. Not because he married into this family, because he showed up when everyone else found an excuse. I lowered the letter. No one spoke. Then something happened I never expected. Rachel slowly stood from the back row. Her attorney looked surprised. Even Kevin turned around. She faced the judge. Your Honor. Her voice trembled. I need to say something. The judge nodded. Go ahead. She looked at me first, then at her brothers. For 30 years, she whispered. I let other people tell me what kind of husband Daniel was. Tears rolled down her face. I never stopped long enough to see him for myself. Kevin snapped. Rachel, sit down. She didn't even look at him. He never asked my father for money. He never asked for the ranch. He never asked for anything. Then she took a slow breath. I was wrong. The judge folded his hands. Several long moments passed before he finally spoke. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Walter Hayes acted knowingly, voluntarily, and with full mental capacity. He looked toward Kevin. The trust shall remain in full force. His gavel struck once. It wasn't loud, but after months of lies, it sounded like truth. When people hear the ending of this story, they usually ask the same question. So, did you inherit the ranch? The answer surprises them every time. No, I didn't. At least not in the way most people imagine. About 2 weeks after the court hearing, Laura Miller invited me back to her office. The winter snow had finally begun to melt, leaving muddy fields and patches of brown grass all over Decatur County. She slid a thick binder across the conference table. The judge signed the final order this morning. I nodded. So what happens now? She smiled. Exactly what Walter wanted. She opened the binder to the trust documents. The ranch belongs to the Hayes Family Trust. I kept reading. Ownership would remain with the trust itself. No individual family member could force a sale. No one could borrow against it. No one could divide it into housing lots without meeting conditions so strict they were practically impossible. Then I reached the page with my name. Successor, Trustee Daniel Carter. I looked up. I don't own any of this. No, but you're responsible for protecting it. Until when? For as long as you're willing. I leaned back in my chair. Walter hadn't given me land. He'd given me responsibility. Some people would have considered that a burden. To me, it felt like the greatest compliment I'd ever received. Kevin and Martin weren't completely disinherited. Walter hadn't wanted revenge through money. He wanted accountability. Each son received a modest inheritance, just enough to acknowledge they were his children. But because they challenged the trust in bad faith and violated the no contest provisions, they lost the opportunity to control the property. That hurt far more than losing dollars. Kevin appealed once. His attorney quietly advised him to stop. The evidence was overwhelming. A few months later, I heard his landscaping company lost 2 commercial contracts. Not because of anything I did. Word had spread. Business owners don't like shaking hands with someone they don't trust. Martin stayed in real estate, but several local ranchers stopped returning his calls again. I never celebrated it. Small towns have long memories. People eventually decide for themselves who deserves their confidence. The ranch itself became my first priority. I wasn't a rancher. I knew enough to admit what I didn't know. So instead of trying to run everything myself, I met with Walter's longtime neighbor, Samuel Reed. Ben had worked the adjoining fields for years. We sat in his pickup one windy afternoon looking across Walter's land. "You interested in leasing it?" I asked. He smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." We worked out a fair agreement over coffee at the kitchen table. No complicated contracts, just honest numbers and a handshake before Laura drew up the paperwork. The field stayed green. The clear's throat, fences stayed repaired. The old red barn received a fresh coat of paint for the first time in nearly 15 years. Every time I drove past, I thought Walter would have approved. Spring turned into summer. Then one Sunday in October, I decided to do something Walter had talked about for years, but never quite managed. We organized a community harvest festival on the ranch. Nothing fancy. A local church youth group ran a bake sale. The volunteer fire department grilled hamburgers and hot dogs. Kids took hay rides through the back fields. An old bluegrass band played under a white tent. Neighbors brought homemade pies. Someone even set up a table where veterans could share old photographs and stories. I spent most of the afternoon helping children feed a pair of stubborn goats that seemed determined to eat everyone's shirt sleeves. For the first time in a long while, the ranch sounded alive again. Not because it was making money, because it was making memories. That evening, just before sunset, I noticed a black SUV slowed down on the county road. Kevin. He never turned into the driveway. He simply sat there for a few seconds. From where I stood, I could see children laughing near the pumpkin patch. Older couples rocking in folding chairs. Neighbors talking the way neighbors used to. Then Kevin quietly drove away. No one waved. No one yelled. Most people didn't even notice he'd been there. Sometimes being forgotten hurts more than being hated. Rachel came to the festival, too. She arrived alone. I spotted her standing near the apple cider stand, looking uncertain, almost like a guest in a place that used to feel familiar. I walked over. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." For a moment, neither of us knew what to say. Finally, she smiled a little. "I heard the goats escaped twice this morning." "They did. They're smarter than they look." She laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in months. Later that afternoon, we sat together on the old porch where Walter and I had shared so many cups of coffee. "I've been going to counseling," she said quietly. "I know. The pastor mentioned he saw you there, too. I've got plenty to work on." She nodded. "So do I." There wasn't a dramatic apology. No speeches. No promises that everything would magically return to normal. Real life rarely works that way. Healing isn't one decision. It's hundreds of small ones. A phone call, dinner together. Learning to listen instead of assuming. By the first weekend of November, we were spending weekends together again. Not because the pain had disappeared. Because we finally stopped pretending it never existed. We moved slowly. That felt honest. A few weeks before New Year's, I visited Walter's grave. The cemetery overlooked rolling ranchland dusted with early snow. The wind carried the smell of pine and wood smoke from nearby houses. I brought something simple, an old pair of worn leatherwork gloves. Years earlier, Walter had forgotten them in my truck after we'd repaired a broken fence together. I'd kept them ever since. I laid them gently against the headstone. "Still showing up?" I said quietly. The wind answered with nothing more than the rustling of dry grass. Somehow that was enough. People sometimes think revenge is about watching someone suffer. I don't believe that anymore. Walter taught me something different. Real justice isn't taking away what someone owns. It's revealing who they are when everyone is finally paying attention. Kevin and Martin weren't defeated because they lost control of a ranch. They defeated themselves long before that. Every selfish choice, every excuse, every opportunity they ignored to simply sit beside their father while he was still alive. That was the real loss. As for me, I drove more than 200 kilometers that morning because everyone else claimed they were too busy. Looking back, it wasn't the longest drive I'd ever made. It was simply the most important. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly stood beside you when life became difficult, I hope you'll take a moment to let them know they mattered. And if you enjoy stories about family, second chances, and justice that feels earned, I'd be honored if you join me again for another.